Today I am going to be sharing with you about chakras and how I use them when it comes to emotional work, because I feel like the way that I use the Eastern philosophies like Ayurvedic doshas and the chakra system is a little bit different to how you might learn them if you read them elsewhere or worked with a practitioner, because a lot of my work is around processing emotions and giving people the techniques to actually process their emotions using verbal dialogue. However, some people are not aware of what emotions are present in their body and therefore what they actually need to process. So without spoiling it, because we do dive into this in the release course, I did want to share a little bit about the chakras and how I use them. Because in the masterclass, I went through the process that I use to process your emotions, improve that metabolism. However, as I mentioned, we store emotions in our body and they can manifest physically, they can manifest mentally, and they can also manifest behaviorally in all sorts of ways. And a lot of people get this concept and they often will go and do lots of other things to try and fix them, natural stuff, conventional, whatever, going to see various therapists, but it still comes back to the emotions and they get this feeling about that. And then they go, great, I want to process the emotions, but I've buried them and I've been so good at suppressing them that I actually don't know what emotions are there for me to process. So this is where the chakra system is really fascinating. And I found it fascinating, especially being a clinical, like a physical therapist, seeing how the body would present and how it wouldn't make sense. And all of a sudden, when I learnt Eastern philosophies using TCM, Ayurveda, in this really simple way, I was able to make sense of people's bodies. And I'll share about doshas in another video and do some social posts on this later. And the way I approach chakras is not about, they are referred to as energy centers, but I rarely talk about them as that in my courses because sometimes it turns people on. I like to address it in a really practical way, and then we do experience the energy of this work when we're in a group, in a community together, discussing and seeing what happens. So I don't take the sort of angle of getting your chakras spinning or they're associated with colors. I don't get you to wear certain colors or anything like that. The way I teach it at a very basic level is learning about what emotions are governed by different chakras, and therefore bringing awareness to what events in your life and situations are stored in your body and therefore what you can process. So really brief overview, there are 7 chakras in the body. They are associated with a color and they all have locations and they have secondary locations. So hands, feet, everywhere in the body, and all of the chakras are on the face. And if you have listened to my podcast on emotional Botox, that is where I talk about all the chakras being represented in the face. And there are some people who are psychosomatic face readers and can tell everything that's going on in your life and your history based on how your face looks. So without obviously going into every single chakra, because I could be here for hours or days, I am just going to cover my favorite one, which majority of people will have some stored emotions around, and that is the sacral chakra. So when people have got issues with the sacral chakra, they can manifest issues physically, mentally, and behaviorally. So I'm always listening to the words and the descriptive words that people use when they are complaining or discussing what their issue is. And this gives me deeper insight as to, okay, where in the body are we looking? Where could things be manifesting? And therefore, what emotion can be processed here? So the sacral chakra governs emotions around relationships in life. And I say these are your intimate relationships, they are your historical relationships, they are also relationships with your parents, grandparents, extended family, siblings, And then it can go into things like fertility. And what I always love to mention around fertility journey is miscarriages and abortions. This is a huge thing that isn't spoken about, that I will always get my clients to process, no matter what's going on really. And then it can be relationship with children, it can be relationship with people in your workplace. When it comes to intimate relationships, it is also about those previous relationships where maybe you cheated on someone or you were cheated on and you haven't actually quite processed that. And then the other partners involved. When it comes to parents, it can be the early separation or divorce, even as an adult, and the emotions around that, and the relationships that your parents then get into that you might not really approve of. And it also governs emotions around your relationship with money, power, and also sexuality and sensuality as well. So it's kind of that pelvic area, it's the inner thighs, and some secondary areas are this part of the hand, the inner part of the heels on the feet, and also this area of the face. And what is really fascinating is I have worked with quite a few people who just have issues in this area of their face and nowhere else. They don't have issues around their hips and pelvis, but it all comes back to the sacral chakra. And it is amazing what you can unpack. So typically I am seeing people who have been around the block and tried lots of things, and none of the conventional, none of the natural, none of like the energetic work they're getting is touching it. And so this is where it's like, well, what is the emotion that's stored there that hasn't been expressed, and therefore it's manifesting in this crazy way? So without speaking directly to a person that has issues, it can be a little bit challenging to unpack it. So I'm just trying to give you the general overview. So physically, how can these emotions around these events in your life manifest? Because the primary area of the sacral chakra is located in your hips and pelvis, this is where you can get hip and pelvic pain, issues, instability, anything like that, anything musculoskeletal. If you go a layer deeper into the internal organs, this is when you can have issues around your reproductive system and therefore your fertility journey, your periods, things like endometriosis, pelvic pain, even stuff like UTIs and anything with the bladder, anything in that pelvic bowl area. Because there's that secondary area, you can get issues around the upper lip with skin in particular. People can sometimes, a lot of kids do this actually, like that, and they scrape their upper lip and you can see that redness. Some people might just break out in this area on their body as well. Those are the physical things that I can think of off the top of my head at the moment. If I think of mental / behavioral stuff, usually I say mental stuff is like anxiety, depression, fears and phobias, but I listen to the words that people use. And for the sacral chakra, it's usually like, I just don't have any joy for life. I don't have this sense of freedom. I feel like I'm locked away. And the sacral chakra governs our emotions around joy for life as well, our creativity, our intuition. It's a very feminine chakra. Feminine energy is about intuition, creativity, emotional expression. But yeah, people feel like, or I ask them, what do you do for joy? And sometimes I tear up because I realize they have no idea, or it's been so long, or they realize that they just haven't been doing any of these things that create joy in their life. So those are the sort of mental issues around the sacral chakra that might come up, and the words that people use. Freedom is a big one, or lack of freedom. And then behavioral, this one's really interesting. So I find that when people have got issues with their sacral chakra, it will often manifest as control, addiction, eating disorders is another big one. So whenever someone tells me they've had a history of eating disorders, and sometimes they've never told anyone except for me, these are things like the anorexia, bulimia, orthorexia, healthy eating, anything that's just, it's controlled. I think, okay, well, what's going on in the sacral chakra? What relationships and emotions do we need to explore there for them to process? Not just to talk about it, but to identify, create awareness, and then process the emotions. Addiction. I talk a little bit about this on the masterclass, but I didn't dive into the chakras. It's the sex, the drugs, the alcohol. Other addictions are present as well. And then OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is usually I've got to do this a few times before I walk out the door, otherwise my day is going to be ruined. But controlling is like jealousy in relationships, not always needing to know where people are or checking their phone, wondering where your kids are, not giving your partner or in your relationships that sense of freedom. It is also when controlling relationships and controlling your environment. So people who are like excessive with cleaning, very controlled with, I said diet, with eating disorders, but also cleanliness. Again, things must be this way for my day to run smoothly. And if anyone puts anything out of place, then I lose it. So these are the behavioral dysfunctions that would lead me to think that someone's got some issues around their sacral chakra. And therefore, if we take some steps back, relationships. And what are those key relationships that have a lot of stored emotion around them that can do with some processing? Because this is where when I find people talk about chakras, they're like, oh, your sacral chakra is blocked. Go and wear orange. Go and play this music. Go and get this aromatherapy oil. And yes, there are elements of sound and smell and vibration that helps with different chakras, but I find that people can often bypass with this. And so that's why I'm all about identify and create awareness around the emotion and then process it using that verbal dialogue process that I shared in the podcast and the most recent podcast that's only going to be up for 12 days and the masterclass as well if you want to see the video version. That's what you do once you identify you have a chakra block, and I'm just sharing what the sacral chakra is and how it manifests because there's so many. And very rarely will people just have like one major block, like there's a little bit going in the base, there's a little bit happening in the solar plexus, but I always cover in depth and will go into this in depth in the release course based on what people present to me to help them understand. I always go in depth into the first three chakras, the base, the sacral, and the solar plexus. And as I say, if you have crossed paths with me before, it really is, is this physical? Is it emotional? Is it human? Is it energetic? Is it a dosha imbalance? Or is it a chakra imbalance? And that's where I love to unpack all of this for individuals. So yeah, it's just really fascinating how we can use Eastern philosophy to understand why and how the body is presenting the way it is. And I really want to share this information because I know there's a lot of people that have got reproductive system issues, fertility issues, control, eating disorders are really common. And too often we just look at other external factors, and it is very challenging for people to look at the emotional stuff. So chakras is the system that I use to help me identify or create awareness around what emotions are stored in the body and therefore manifesting in these undesirable ways, physically, mentally, behaviorally. And then the next step is the process that I share on the replay around how to actually process your emotions. So feel free to share or tag your friends in this. I will pop it on my video roll and on my grid, always trying to get this information further. And if you do want to dive into the release course, which is just the energy of this space is amazing. There's live calls with me where I teach and I coach. I've got a team who are amazing coaches. People dive in and they make big changes. Go and grab the replay if you just want to find out a little bit more about how I operate. Because it is important if you're going to dive into some vulnerable stuff that you do feel safe in this environment. It is incredible and I cannot wait.